Hello, people. We are live, I presume. So nice to meet you all from my behalf. I'm Sakari. I'm CEO at Azure, an Azure MVP, and a Microsoft Regional Director. And I'm here with excellent guy called Jussi. How you doing?
All good here. Thanks for having me. Hello, everybody over there remotely. My name is Jussi. I work as an Azure Developer Audience Lead at Microsoft.
It's good to have you here, and I'm pretty sure we will have exciting discussions since we have practiced this so much.
Yes, this will be fun.
So, without further ado, today we will be talking about security in Azure in many forms. We will be talking a little bit for decision makers, a little bit for operations and management people, and then we will have something for developers as well. Before that, I'd like to say that Zure, who is hosting this webinar about secure Azure applications, does 100% Azure with 60 experts, and that's all we do. And our experts have 14 years of experience on average. We have 7 gold certificates from Microsoft and 4 Azure MVPs. We advise, design, build, support Azure environments and solutions in Finland and Belgium. Whew. I got through that, did you see?
Yeah, that was super fast. I was expecting maybe 20 minutes on that, and then we get to the actual content.
I thought it would be 20 minutes, but yeah. I only took 30 seconds of hyperventilation.
Thank you for this. So what do we have on the plate today?
So first, we're going to talk about the general security landscape. From there, we'll look at how to securely manage Azure. And the next step is looking at, some of the regular things developers should think about when they develop a solution on Azure.
And perhaps worth highlighting here that we have some super interesting content coming up, and we will be sharing the slides as well.
Yes.
So if you make notes, please feel free to do so, but rest assured that we will share the content as well.
Yes, the PDF, links to the PDF and this presentation will be sent to you after this live webinar. If you have any questions afterwards, feel free to ask them of us and we will get back to you. So first we have this slide from Microsoft. Please, Jussi, tell us, how does Microsoft see the security landscape of today?
So my plan is to perhaps spend 2 hours on this, and I'm not sure if we have any time for your content. So to get started, the security landscape, I always like a slide when it has a circle, because you can put anything in there and it looks relevant at the same time.
It's the best.
So there's some fancy animation. I trust that you will be my slide master today. Usually the security landscape comprises of on-premises. A lot of companies still have plenty of investments and assets in on-premises. And back in the day, we would have the DMZ or whatever you would call it, that would sort of allow somebody external to access some of your services. And now, of course, we have the public cloud on the right. And when you combine these and then you factor in security and look at the whole landscape, of course, somebody in charge of finances is worried about the rising costs. And one thing that I'm super happy now seeing is that beyond DevOps and DevSecOps, we also have something called FinOps, finance operations.
And what is that?
That's about worrying and thinking and monitoring and planning, how do you finance this whole thing? So instead of asking somebody's credit card, I think you have a few, so I could use that.
Sure, they're empty.
To spin up an Azure subscription and say, well, let's hope this won't cost too much. Let's actually plan and budget for this. Let's actually put some limitations so that nobody's able to spin up a virtual machine that I saw Mark Husinovich actually spin up on Twitter a couple of days ago. I think it has 24 terabytes of RAM and 448 cores. I was afraid to ask how much that's going to cost you.
To Mark. I think it doesn't cost Mark much. But to rest of us, maybe?
To rest of us, it might be a bit expensive, unless you have the need. But anyway, the idea with FinOps, of course, is to control the costs, but also to understand the that what's the investment here? Are we getting the business value? And if we are, how would we then internally manage these finances and cost? But then when you add security in here, on the left-hand side, you have increasing complexity, a lot of moving parts. If you're building something for hybrid, if you have edge computing, what do you do with your own premises thing? Are you upgrading something in there? But then on the cloud, of course, that keeps on increasing new services, new capabilities, new opportunities. And then the evolving threats. How should we manage security for the whole landscape? Instead of looking at one virtual machine and one web app, perhaps one database, we need to see the whole landscape and combine that with, which I think many in the audience are familiar with, the talent gap.
Yeah.
We simply don't have enough people with enough experience to manage all of this for all of the companies, all of the partners, all of the customers.
Yeah. Your next slide, I think, actually captures this complexity well, because if you look at this and you think, like I personally, I live in the Azure bubble. I only see the Azure market, and then I follow some other clouds as well. But basically, from recruitment perspective, if a decision maker right there now is thinking about recruiting somebody for the Azure or cloud or the holistic enterprise security, then this is the stack they will be saddled with. And at the same time, the talent gap exists. It's hard to find Azure developers and Azure architects. And I think it might be even harder to find people who are focused on security. There might be even less of those. And today, of course, everybody realizes this, and it's good to understand this. Today, of course, we try to come up with Jussi on what are the things Azure can bring to you, so that you don't have to hire those people, but also how do you see the issue of this talent gap, and everybody's getting attacked, not just big institutions, but everybody is being attacked, and how can that be handled if the truth is that not every organization can handle it themselves?
Indeed. One of my favorite examples here is that back in maybe 1996 or 1997, I do realize it was a long time ago, I was working for a local company here in Finland.
Netscape?
No.
Okay, cool.
And one of my responsibilities was to get a hold of this new thing that just came out, Windows NT 4. Ooh. Specifically the server edition, not the workstation one. And at the time, we used to have, paper manuals. Mm-hmm. You're so young, so you might not know what those are, but it's pieces of paper stacked together.
I never needed the manuals. Yeah. I don't know what's up with you.
And what I did then, I leaned back on my chair, I read through the whole manual, and then I could say, I know everything about Windows security now. Yeah. I know the NT4 domains, I know how domain admin works, I know how the different policies worked at the time. And in a way, it was more manageable at the time. Yeah. You could brain dump the info, and then you would say, I'm good, I'm set for security-related consulting for the next X years, before Windows 2000 came out.
Yeah.
But now, when you manage complexity, as you can see in this picture, you have a lot of different services. Those might be in on-premises, in the cloud, and it might be that you go really deep into, let's say, containers. And I sometimes see people going really deep into, let's say, Kubernetes, and they know all the different bits and pieces in there, but anything outside that might not be anything they worry about at all. Mm. So you need to have this different sets of people and professionals with different skill sets, and they need to be able to communicate. So it's also about the people, not just about understanding all the command line tools and reading docs.microsoft.com to actually understand something. And then putting all of this together and still figuring out what's relevant in terms of security, and are we still enabling business? Or are we just stopping and shutting down everything? It's super secure now, but there's no business happening anymore.
I think that's a good point, and I think we are going to get back to people and processes soon, as we are setting the scene, and we'll stop doing it soon. But what's the silver lining today? Okay, then you could have read the manual and you would have known everything. Unfortunately, I remember having a version of Windows that didn't come with the manual, it came from a friend on discs.
On a CD.
So it didn't have a paper manual. So today you can, Google and Bing are pretty good. So you can find the thing you are looking for. Instead, in the paper manual, you had to read everything. And now that's impossible. I think it's important for people today to realize that you are not even supposed to read everything right now. Let's go forward.
Yeah.
Are you ready?
I am. I think I am.
Excellent.
So this is a super busy slide. There's a lot of links in there, but as we said, you're going to get a copy of the content as well. So the top 10 best practices, I think we lost a picture.
Did we?
Are we good? Let me see.
Oh.
There's a device here. I think I briefly, accidentally perhaps touched on this.
Oh.
And now it's rebooting.
Hey, first mishap. We budgeted 5.
Do we need to share again?
Yes, I think we do.
But thankfully we're on Teams live event, so there's like a 30-second delay for the audience.
So they think everything is fine.
Yeah.
As long as they don't hear us.
Let's see how it goes.
So I think I'm gonna stop sharing.
Yeah, and you need to share it again.
Yeah.
So this is part of the operational security here.
Yes.
If you leave something close to Jussi, he might fiddle with that and it might break.
So my computer is kind of waking up here.
Yeah, let's see.
So there's signal.
There we go.
And there's picture.
I promise not to touch this anymore. I will step.
Thank you, sir. I knew I should have been on that side.
Next time.
So the busy slide with a lot of links.
Yes, a lot of links here. So this is the top 10 plus 1 best practices. And what I really like about this is that you have 3 main categories. You have people, process, and technology. And I know, Sakari, you and myself, we both love technology. If there's something new and you can fiddle with the settings and scale it and deploy it, that's the best thing ever. But sometimes, and quite often nowadays, you have to factor in that you have people as well. And once you factor in the people, you need something to connect the people with the technology. And that's where process comes in. So
that's keyboard.
Yes. And when you have a look at the top 10 things here, obviously in people, everybody needs to understand cloud security, what the journey is. There's additional content behind the links, of course. But then for technology, I don't think we need to spend any time on passwordless or multi-factor authentication, because that's something
you should already have.
We've been talking about that for years now.
Yeah.
And even then, I still do see a lot of global admin accounts with no MFA enabled because it's too challenging to deploy or whatever. So once you sort of internalize this, you will also see the foundational architecture. And these are called foundational because once you decide on these main bits, like should we have a single directory, single identity, or multiple, and what happens with the identities we already have in the local NT4 domain or Active Directory domain. Once you set these 3, then they sort of need to align with the people, process, and technology.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on this?
Well, the one that really grabs my attention is actually below there in architecture decisions. So this is probably on the table of people who are in your organization thinking about enterprise architecture, enterprise or business architects, and it's the single directory / identity. And it's about an organization having an identity storage, an identity provider in the cloud, not many times, but hopefully just once. And of course, when it's Microsoft and Azure, we are talking about Azure AD. But this is something if Jussi runs into admins, global admins not having MFA, I tend to run into organizations that are really strongly thinking about, hey, we have 5 AD forests in classic Active Directory. Could we just like lift and shift these AD forests and then we'd have 5 Azure ADs? And Microsoft best practice is to have a single directory. That's how Azure AD is built. But it comes to people and process. People who've been working with identities and access management for the last 20 years, they are very familiar with AD forest and 1 or 2-way trust, a thing Azure AD doesn't have. And that's something at least to look at right now. Otherwise, I think these pretty much make sense, and many of them are pretty much accepted as well. Like people on the other side of the camera are probably thinking, yeah, of course, that's important, and people need to understand and so forth. But the journey there might take time, of course.
It will, and it's not too many years ago that many times when you would visit a customer and you would talk about the public cloud and Azure AD and the different possibilities, somebody in the audience, somebody in the meeting would say, hey, sounds really good, but we have this thing here that we set 19 years ago with Active Directory, and we really love this setup, so it needs to be reflected in the cloud. So can you just make sure that nothing will change, but we will still get all the fancy new things?
Yeah.
And then you sort of have to say, well, no, could we perhaps revisit your decisions 20 years ago and see if there's something we could change now when we evolve and move in with the new opportunities.
Yeah.
And the single directory, how do we manage identities? That's probably from all of these different
actual tools you have to use in Azure to create a secure environment and create a secure cloud for your organization. And I asked Jussi if he's the master of all of these, and he said, just like in 2009, he still is the master of some of these.
Indeed. And well, we already spoke a bit about multi-factor authentication. That's perhaps not relevant here. But what's interesting is that there's a lot of the common services that you have had for so many years as you've been working in IT. As an example, log management is one of those. It's slightly boring, but it's super critical, and you really need to get that right.
If you're talking about applications and application insights, it's not boring at all.
No,
if you're talking about all the things you get from virtual machines, yeah, it's slightly boring.
That's slightly boring, yes, but you still have to sort of do it.
You do.
And what I'd like to highlight here is Azure Sentinel. It's on the lower right corner with CM, and that of course goes hand in hand with log analytics because it needs the logs, and you really need to get that right.
And what is Azure Sentinel?
Azure Sentinel allows you to gather all of your application and security logs and then apply analysis to see if there's something you need to worry about security. Exactly.
Okay.
And with Azure Sentinel, it's amazing because before we had a cloud-based solution like Azure Sentinel, you would often have a look at an existing infrastructure and ask, what do you have in place to manage your logs and centralize and analyze them? And somebody would say, well, we have this virtual machine, it's capable of doing it. Alrighty, so what if we direct everything from the cloud to this single VM and analyze? And the person would go, yeah, not a good idea because I haven't really built it for that. It's for my own testing. But now with Azure Sentinel, you can just bolt it on top of everything and start adding the different providers. Would we like to get analysis from Windows 10? How about Office 365 services? And then based on that, you start getting intelligent advisories and alerts to understand what should we fix, or is our defense in depth correctly built?
It sounds like you really like Sentinel. Is that one of the, like, you can see how many boxes this is. This is like 20 boxes. So, 25 boxes. So if you would recommend one of these for the IT pros, for the people who are doing the cloud operations and cloud management, is Azure Sentinel like in top 3 of what you would recommend for them to Google about?
I would definitely say Azure Sentinel is something you really need to start paying attention to now. And multi-factor, of course, that's
so
the
Azure AD as a tool.
Azure AD as a tool, the security capabilities in there, like conditional access and what have you. And perhaps to highlight one more from here is privileged identity management, or PIM. And often when I talk with admins and they ask, hey, what's this PIM thing? I need to say, well, it's a tool that will take away your admin access. And then you can.
Do you start with that? Do you start with that?
I start with this, and then
cool.
you can request and apply to get that access back for, let's say, 8 hours.
Yeah.
And they really start hating you, and perhaps PIM. No, I don't want that because I feel warm with my global admin access available at all times.
Yeah.
And that's the whole thing. You shouldn't be constantly logged in with such an account with so many privileges, and instead go with a regular user and then request when you need the access, when you do maintenance and management.
But who approves of that request, and doesn't it create bureaucracy and slow everything up?
So you can put yourself as an approver, so that's good.
Okay, that makes sense. So, okay, you start with, I'm going to take your admin up.
Yeah.
No, I'm going to make you approve you. And then,
Yes.
oh, yeah.
And now it's finally good. But usually you would perhaps have a team in there. And that's also to have some sort of a trail that we can say, oh, so yesterday you did this, but today this happened. So let's have a look what went wrong.
Yeah. Cool. That's very, for a budding developer like myself, looking at the apps and data security, this box is clearly for management of Azure and management of a large entity, and not from the perspective of a single application. In that sense, that as a developer, I don't see many things except on a very high level, like encryption, key management, certificate management, and stuff like that. But for sure, in a couple of slides, we'll actually get back to these themes from a developer's perspective, and we'll revisit these from a perspective of having Azure help you to execute those in a more efficient manner with less coding, and so you can code something exciting maybe. Is there something you would like to highlight this, or do we show the slide of mammoths, the monster slide?
Before we move to the monster slide, perhaps to highlight here, you do not need to deploy all of this. You do not need to learn all of this.
Yeah.
But the idea is that you understand the landscape again, and then you decide what fits your organization. And often I see companies perhaps going with Azure Sentinel or key management or something. And then later on, when the thinking evolves, the business requirements advance, then there might be an additional ask. Perhaps somebody in HR is asking, how are we actually doing this? Can you help us with this sort of solution? And that also then demands you to deploy additional services or additional capabilities.
And I have to add on top of that this might sound scary to at least to the decision makers out there who are like, oh my God, that security in Azure is so complicated. And of course, security is complicated today, but also Azure is the way that when you log in and start using it, you cannot not see role-based access. It comes out of the package. You're like, okay, I gotta give this person a role, and then you're making conscious decision if that person is an admin or something else. Multi-factor authentication is a ding, toggle in Azure AD, done. So many of these things are made in such a manner that you take a stance in them automatically. And then if you want to do something, it's pretty easy. And Azure also sends you email telling, hey, you haven't done this, and looking at your organization, maybe you should do this. So that's the advisor thing Jussi has been referring to. So it's not as scary as it might sound, but it is still scary enough when we go further down the rabbit hole.
Yes, let's do this.
Ready for the rabbit hole?
I am.
So this is the sexiest slide. I'm pretty sure you can see there's other cloud logos here. There's AWS, AWS, and that's Salesforce, that gray blob, that's Salesforce. But this is pretty cool slide. What do you think this slide says, Jussi?
I love this slide. So I've used the slide with all the Microsoft security related services and tools a couple of times in different events. And it's one slide filled with just product names.
Yeah.
And people are super scared when they see this. But now this is a bit more approachable because you have arrows.
Yes, and there's a black bar.
Yeah.
Azure AD is here very big. And that's, of course, the single directory, single identity is here represented. So that's nice. Internal access.
So perhaps you have the stakeholders here.
Yeah.
So that's business speak for users.
Oh, cool.
And the external users, meaning customers, partners, whoever, guests, come from there. And the idea here really is to depict that Azure AD is the heart of everything. This is the single identity thinking. Of course, you could have multiple of these.
Yes.
And based on this, you start building everything else around this to factor in security as well.
Yeah. So we will walk you guys through this slide, or actually we will show you this slide in its entirety. It will be part of the resources we sent you, but we won't spend a lot of time because look at this thing go.
I love this.
More. There's like more and more boxes coming out of all places. I think what's meaningful here, and these are all somewhat interesting, but this green area here is per application control. So that's interesting. Here we get to talking about some concrete things like API management, web application firewall, key vault, and things like this that we will look at soon a little bit more. But what's cool here, and I know Jussi wants to highlight, is cloud adoption framework and well-architected framework. What are these two different looking boxes here?
So they should perhaps be slightly bigger here because they also resonate heavily with Azure AD, and these are the foundational frameworks. So cloud adoption framework, that's how do you get to the cloud? It involves both business-focused and technically oriented content on how do we migrate, how do we assess, how do we set cost, how do we actually monitor and manage once we get to public cloud?
Securely.
Yes, that too. And well-architected framework perhaps is an evolvement from that. Now that we often have companies who have been in the cloud for 10 years now, even perhaps longer, and now they really need to understand what do we do next? What are the best practices for security, for governance, for monitoring, for management? So well-architected framework here, this is key in understanding and operating the big picture in here. And pay attention, there's some usual suspects here, like Windows Hello. So if you have a device, often you have in a laptop or in an external camera, you might have a camera or a fingerprint reader, super basic stuff in the sense, but often you dictate those settings through policies, through Azure AD, and say, this is how we want to run the whole thing. And then you apply the framework on top of this to better understand that, okay, the best practice sort of says this is our setup, how do we align this? And then you're free to deviate from the best practices if you think you know better.
Yeah. So this slide is pretty full of stuff. You can peruse it at your leisure later when you get the material. But cloud adoption framework, if your organization is at that stage, look through that. And well-architected framework, if you are architecting and developing things, look at that. It's pretty good from development perspective as well. And later we will show you a scorecard about what the results of a well-architected framework review looks like. I think that we could go forward and start the development segment of this talk. We have about 10 minutes left. And as you can see, we've now moved to more of Microsoft slides. This is as beautiful as the previous slides.
I love this. It's simple, it's aesthetic.
There's internet. It means two-way communication.
Got it.
Cool.
I'm still on track. Please continue.
Sure. So, if you are a development team or you're a decision maker or an IT pro there and you know that there's somebody developing something in Azure, and there are some elements that are pretty common when we think of development on platform as a service with native components of Azure. And this slide contains a hypothetical application of which there exists thousands out there, and this probably fits like 85% of applications in Azure that are native in that sense. Now, if you are creating an application, you of course need some kind of a DevOps environment from which you do automated deployments of your application, where you have your code versioning, your code repository, and so forth. So this slide starts from you having an Azure DevOps or GitHub down below these two icons, and the notable points there are to notice that in no case should your development team have secrets in the Git or other code repository you have in those environments. And by secrets, I'm talking about passwords, connection strings, access keys, certificates, and stuff like that. you should, as a team, code review for security. You should code review for other notations as well, and syntax and logical errors and all that stuff. But your team should have a mentality of thinking about security as well. Later in this slide, you will see some ways that Azure can help you with this, and in pretty some amazing ways, but all of those ways cost money. And if team isn't thinking about building a secure application, none of those things will help. Infrastructure as code. Your environment in the cloud should be deployed automatically from Azure Resource Management, ARM templates, or with some other tool you might be familiar with if ARM isn't one of your favorite languages in specifying environments. Test. Now, if you are looking to build a application that is a little bit more secure, you can put this secure DevOps kit. That is a kit from Microsoft. You can put that as part of your CI/CD pipeline testing and get the results if your application security from this secure DevOps kit perspective is worsening. And please remember to update your framework and libraries so that they take into consideration any new vulnerabilities, and also track the third-party libraries you are using in case there are some new vulnerabilities found in those. Jussi, how do you feel about what I just said?
Well, I'm still on step 1, no secrets in Git or repo. So that probably means storage account keys as well.
Yes, please.
Yeah, after we're done with this, I need to do something.
Let's. Now the next step is actually to the secrets, and this is Key Vault. So when you have application here in this example, you have app service running the compute that has your backend, your business logic, and it is connected to Azure Key Vault, and that is where your application is runtime getting the secrets when it needs them. They are not part of your project management tooling or any of that stuff. This is where you put the stuff, and I know you are very familiar with Key Vault.
Yeah, I can't keep my hands off from Key Vault.
Cool. Application insights, no-brainer to any people who have experience, but I suspect we have people who don't have experience in developing to Azure. This is the tool you use to get the telemetry from your applications. And it doesn't just collect the telemetry, it shows you nice diagrams, it sends you email, it has intelligence into detecting anomalies and giving you the insight on if there's something wrong with your application or if there might be something wrong. And you can add custom events, and you can also add custom monitoring into application insights. There's cool Custo query language behind it you can use to query all the events in a very performant manner. So look at application insights if it's not something you are familiar with. Now this is something we don't see as often. Now Azure Front Door or Azure Application Gateway are a little bit different tools, but either of them can provide Web Application Firewall. And Web Application Firewall, if you route the messages from internet or wherever to your service through the Web Application Firewall, it will catch, for example, OWASP 10 vulnerabilities or security risk. OWASP 10 is the top 10 security risks for web applications, and you can check those now. For example, injections is still top 1 security risk for applications. Top 2 is broken authentication. Now, Web Application Framework will catch those kind of malicious attacks just by you putting that between your client and app service. And what's great about this, I think, is that it automatically updates itself to reflect the current state of OWASP 10. Now, there's one other scenario where this is very interesting. One is that it's very cool when you're migrating an older legacy application and you're like, my God, this app has been in on-prem inside our network. Can we or dare we put it to so that it's more approachable by externals? And then you're like, okay, let's put Web Application Firewall on top of it, on front of it, and it will help. Yes, it will help. Bad news is that your legacy application or legacy applications in general might have calls to them that are directly SQL. That's a SQL injection. So your web application firewall will strip that off, and those calls won't go to your legacy application if your legacy application isn't secure from ground up. So in a lift and shift scenario where many of you might be right now with some part of your application portfolio, think about using web application firewall, but be certain to check the application so that it doesn't have any normal queries that seem malicious from OWASP 10 viewpoint. Now, Azure Front Door, I think it's at the cheapest, it's like $100 or euros a month, and Azure Application Gateway is a little bit more expensive, and the pricing is very complex, as always in these kind of scenarios, because it's about bandwidth and that kind of stuff. But still, it's something that can magically make your application better if you are facing security risks. Are you a fan of Web Application Firewall?
I am. I'm a huge fan of that, and it's been around for a long time already. Yeah. So it's pretty stable, it's fairly well understood, and I would always advocate at least go with Web Application Firewall to begin with, and then figure out how Front Door would fit in there, and oftentimes it does fit in there.
Yeah, exactly. Check it out. The next thing, in an application you have data, and from security point of view, the data should be encrypted in transit and at rest. Now in transit, HTTPS, pretty standard. Many Azure things like App Service are supporting that naturally. And do remember to use your own certificates. And at rest, Azure Data Lake, Azure SQL, and Cosmos DB are examples here. In most applications we've seen, developer team uses like 2 of those 3, in some cases all 3. Good news is that all 3 of those encrypt your data at rest automatically. Now, what's interesting when we come to the next bit with authentication and authorization. So here we talk about how people access and how services access each other. And here we wanted to elevate managed identity. If managed identity is not familiar to you, it's magic by its other name. Basically, it means that you as a developer team do not have to think about secrets. You do not have to generate identities. You just configure App Service and Azure SQL, for example, to communicate with managed identity, and Azure will take care of that securely inside the platform for you. Of course, it means server access or system access and not personal access. For personal access, Azure Data Lake, Azure SQL, and Cosmos DB all support Azure AD security groups and user identities, but there are some things that you should look at those. For example, Azure Data Lake for file or folder, it supports 30 different entities. So if you have a file that is needed by more than 30 groups, security groups, then that might not be the best way to go by adding the security groups into Azure Data Lake access control list. And on the managed identity inside Cosmos DB, it is just the SQL API, previously known as Document DB, that supports managed identity at this point in time. So I can say these things because I don't work at Microsoft, but this is a work in progress. It's looking very good from a developer perspective. And this is a holistic overview on what you should think of as a development team if you have these different levels down. Jussi, what do you think about this? Perhaps
sort of to highlight here, I really like this sort of simplification, but if you really need to focus on some bits here, it would be Azure Key Vault and Application Insights. These are often the ones that I'm not seeing that often utilized in architecture.
Yeah, and maybe this managed identity. Yes. It's pretty new, so it's natural that it hasn't caught up yet, but still it's pretty amazing from a development perspective.
Indeed, I think there's plenty to digest here. On the next slide, we do have Web Application Firewall. Perhaps let's go this through super quickly because you sort of already tackled this.
Yeah, there's right here, this picture I think is from Application Gateway. So in the previous scenario, we had Azure Front Door, of which Web Application Firewall is part of. And here we have application gateway, of which web application firewall is also part of. And this app gateway can be used to protect your virtual network where you might have your virtual machines. So just to make it clear that web application firewall is not just for native applications, it's also for your infrastructure as a service.
Indeed, and for your VMs, of course, they might have a local firewall solution, but often you want to centrally manage and monitor something, and that's where you get web application firewall and also app gateway possibilities tackled on top of this.
Exactly. And now, ladies and gentlemen, this is the last slide before we sign off. We are a little bit over the time, but because we had some issues with voice, probably our voices were just too deep and glorious.
That's what I like to think.
The previous mic couldn't handle it.
Indeed. But we only had like 3 issues out of 5, so I think we're still good. Unless I kick something now.
We can do 2 more.
What is this? This is the well-architected framework review. So there's an assessment tool, and once you get the content, you can actually click on the topic, the title here, so you get to the tool, and it allows you to assess what your current scenario is. And this gives you the results. So you can see from the results different categories. One might be security. So perhaps you want to focus on this first. Cost optimization in this example is fairly well set. But then reliability, performance, and operational excellence are crucial as well. So this is really a tool to map the framework to your current status and assess what should we focus on next.
It is when I look at the operational excellence recommended actions, there's clearly some actions that might not be interesting for the business owner or the product owner of the thing you are building. Like, for example, deploy to multiple regions and instances. Might not be interesting if it's not business critical enough. But then there's like instrument your workload with Azure Application Insights, implement alerting and monitoring, automate manual tasks. Now, if this guy, well-architected review, finds those issues, now those issues, well, they are interesting. App.
Yeah, and as it's a framework, you need to apply that locally to your needs.
Yeah.
A super quick example, yesterday Microsoft announced that a new Azure region is being opened in Denmark. And if you live, let's say you do business in Copenhagen, the capital of Denmark, and you've used North Europe or West Europe or what have you, but now you realize, pretty soon we're going to have a local Azure data center for Danish customers. Then you might not need to utilize a lot of different regions if your specific business case simply says this is enough.
Yeah.
So apply these based on your current status.
Exactly. Now, this has been our show, pretty flawless, even if I say it myself. Thank you, Jussi.
Thank you for having me. Thank you to the audience for sticking with us.
It was a pleasure to talk with you. And till next time, cheers.
Thanks.